Okay, welcome to Chapter 7, and this chapter is about activity-based costing. And a lot of the chapter, we're going to be looking at overhead rates used to allocate the indirect cost. So sometimes the simple cost systems are not always good in terms of matching the overhead with how you use that overhead to make various products. And it can result in overcosting some jobs and undercosting others. So that's what we're going to be looking today, is different ways to allocate costs that's a better reflection of how the overhead is actually being used. So we've covered this previously, the plant overhead rate, so your predetermined manufacturing overhead rate. So in this case, the overhead's $1 million, and the cost driver is direct labor hours. So this would be more of a manual operation as opposed to an automated operation. So what we're saying here is direct labor hours is driving your overhead. So it's $1 million divided by 62,500, which tells you that for every hour, direct labor hour that's worked, you're going to be allocating $16 per unit or per hour in overhead. So here you're looking at two particular dental products, a crown and a mouth guard. So the overhead rate we're going to be charging is $16. So for the crown, they used 11 and a half hours of labor. So it's 11 and a half hours times $16 per hour. So the overhead allocated is 184. And the same approach for the mouth guard, $16 per direct labor hour times 2 hours, $32. So that's how much overhead you're going to assign to each of these products. And companies like to look at their cost in terms of what is actually driving the cost. It can help you make better decisions. It helps you make better estimates. And the more simplistic the system is, the more greater the likelihood is that it could lead to cost distortions. So although overhead allocation calculations usually apply to manufacturing operations, it can also be used by service companies as well as government agencies. So one way to break down your overhead cost is by looking at the cost per activity. So when you're looking at activity-based costing, you're looking at all of the different activities that is involved in making a particular product. And it provides a separate rate for each activity. So rather than have one manufacturing overhead rate, in this example, you could have 6. Because the main activities in manufacturing would be, in this case, machine setup, materials handling, fabricating, supervising, inspecting, and packaging. So each of these activities are likely using overhead to a differing degree. So just assigning one rate is not as helpful as breaking down your overhead according to major activities. So you have to identify all of the activities, which we just did, and estimate how much overhead is going to be allocated to each activity. So we're still talking about the $1 million, but we're just using a different method to allocate it out. So first of all, you're identifying your main activity, and here receiving, preparation, so you have your indirect materials, and so I'm not going to read each one of those, but you can see we have our 6 activities and then our description of what's involved in each of these activities. So what we're seeing is that for instance, the preparation and fabrication, they're using overhead to a greater extent than, say, receiving or packaging. So the full $1 million still gets allocated, but it's doing it according to activity. So what you want to do next is, once you identify the main activities, you want to find the cost driver. So what's causing the cost to be incurred? So receiving would be the number of jobs. So how many jobs are you undertaking? So here it's 8,000. Preparation, like how many molds are you making? So 16,000 molds. Fabrication, here the fabrication cost would be based on direct labor hours, and the same for casting. And finishing, it's based on the number of units, and then packaging, again, based on number of jobs. So you have your activity and you have your allocation base, which is basically what is the activity that's driving that particular cost. So the next step is that you have your total costs for receiving, and we know receiving is driven by the number of jobs. So you take your 80,000, divide by the 8,000 jobs, which would leave you with a rate of $10 per job. Preparation, for example, the next one, you have $200,000 in cost, and that's driven by the number of molds. So you have 16,000 molds. So that works out to be $12.50 per mold, and so on. So you have a different allocation rate for each of your main activities. So then what you want to do here is you want to actually assign your cost. So you take your allocation rate and you multiply it by the number of activities for each area. So receiving, it's $10 per job. They just had one job, so it's $10, and so on. So again, you would be given the level of activities for each of the categories in a problem. So it's fairly straightforward. You just take your rate and you multiply it by the number of activities taking place. So the total cost here, when you look at all the activities combined, we're looking at $39.50. So you have some jobs that maybe don't necessarily use every activity, so they're only being charged overhead to the extent that they use it. So every product is not necessarily going to be using overhead at the same level, and that's the whole point of activity-based costing. So previously, using just one rate, just taking your $1 million and dividing it out over all of your products, you ended up allocating overhead of $184 to the crowns and $32 to the mouth guards. But by using activity-based costing, where you're breaking down your manufacturing into the 6 different activities, you end up with more accurate costing. So what happens is the gold crowns would be allocated $145 in overhead, whereas the mouth guards, the cost of that actually goes up to $39.50. So the way activity-based costing works, it's more accurate than the plant-wide overhead rate because it looks at the specific resources that each product uses and the extent to which they use each resource. So the implications, it's interesting because if under the plant-wide overhead rate here for the gold crowns, $184, but in actual fact the overhead is closer to the $145.50. So it could make Gold Crowns look unprofitable because you've allocated such a huge amount of overhead to it when it's not as high as you had anticipated. Mouth guards, you've got those being allocated a cost of $32 when you just use the one overhead rate, whereas when you use activity-based costing, the overhead for mouth guards is actually higher. So you could have underpriced that if you were not using activity-based costing. So we mostly talk about activity-based costing in the manufacturing sector. However, it's used in the service sector as well. But most of the problems you're going to see is more in the manufacturing area. Another thing to consider here is cost hierarchy. Some costs are incurred at a unit level, some at a batch level, some at a product, and some at a facility level. So unit level, it's a cost that's incurred for every unit, whereas batch level, it doesn't matter how many units are in the batch, that cost is incurred for every batch. Product, here the cost is incurred for each product regardless of the number of batches produced. And facilities level, this is a cost that's incurred by the plant, and it's not driven by number of products or batches or units produced. So if you think about a facility activity level, you know, the cost of insurance, you know, it's not going to change in relation to the number of products or units produced. So when you break your costs down, so using the plant-wide overhead rate is obviously just one calculation, it's straightforward. However, when you move to a system such as ABC, activity-based costing, it takes more time and money to do these calculations, and it's definitely more expensive to operate. And activity-based costing is not in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles. So it's used more for internal management decisions, but for your financial statements, you've got to use the one costing system. So if you decide to implement activity-based costing in a company, you have to look at how much it's going to cost you to implement that system, and is it really worth it? So now we're going to look at some of the benefits and limitations. So when you have activity-based costing, then you would also likely have activity-based management. So once you look at each of the cost categories, you're going to be drilling down into that to focus on any areas where you can eliminate waste, delays, defects, and so on. So it gives you more detailed information, and then management can use that information to improve the operations of the company. So activity-based management, here you'd be looking at product and price decisions, planning and control, and cutting costs. So these are the major activities of activity-based management. So once you have the information available through activity-based costing, you may end up changing your prices. Remember, the mouth guards weren't as expensive as you had thought because you had assigned too much overhead to them, whereas the mouth guards, you may have been selling those at a loss because your overhead was actually higher than what you had thought. And this may lead you to change your prices. It may also lead you to make a decision to move away from less profitable products. Just gives you a more accurate picture. And again, if you're a merchandising or service company, activity-based costing can help you identify the most profitable product or service, and also which customers are really helping you make more profits. So if the cost of implementing activity-based costing and an activity-based management system, if it exceeds the benefits, then you probably don't want to do it. So you would look at how much overhead was charged out when you use just one plant-wide rate versus when you use activity-based costing. So if you're not going to get a lot of benefit from it, then you don't want to tie up employee time producing this information if it's not actually beneficial. So as we've discussed earlier, some of the benefits include better pricing decisions, identifying cost savings opportunities, but the benefits are higher when the risk of cost distortion is higher. So some products use overhead at a different rate than other products. So when there's a huge variation in the use of overhead, then this would be a situation where you'd want to use activity-based costing. So some products may use overhead at a much greater rate than others. In that type of situation, you'd probably want to use activity-based costing. So if you already have a good, versatile accounting system in place and a strong information technology support, it's easier to implement activity-based costing. And, when companies are pleased that they adopted ABC, it's often when, costs are increasing. But it's not a cure for everything. It just gives management more information. If they don't act on the information and drill down and figure out why things are costing more than expected and take action on it, it's not going to be all that helpful unless you actually use the information that activity-based costing is providing. So the next steps, now that you've reviewed this video, is make sure you look at the demonstration problem and video, and then do the quick check PowerPoints and of course the problems listed in the syllabus for this course. And that's it for this module.